The blood hadn't fully dried on the palace stones when the whispers began. In the shadowed corridors where once the firm footsteps of Alexander the Great had echoed, now only the muffled sound of conspiracies and the metallic scent of impending doom remained. There, amidst the marble columns that had witnessed the rise of an empire, a young man of ethereal beauty watched with almond-shaped eyes as everything he had known as power crumbled. Bagoas, the Persian eunuch whose very existence defied conventions of masculinity and submission, held in his trembling hands the last thread connecting him to the man who had conquered the known world, and his heart. The blade that mutilated him at the age of 12 had been only the first cut in a series of wounds that would scar his life. On that distant day, when Persian soldiers invaded his mountain village in what is now Afghanistan, Bagoas was still a child with large eyes and silky hair that gleamed like polished copper under the sun. His father, a small spice merchant, tried to hide him in the storerooms, but the boy's singular beauty was impossible to disguise. The screams that echoed that morning, first his mother's, then his own, still resonated in his memory like a ghostly echo that would never leave him. The castration had been performed with the clinical precision reserved for future occupants of royal harems. The Persian physician, with practiced hands and an indifferent gaze, had murmured words in a language Bagoas didn't yet fully understand, while hot irons cauterized his child's flesh. The pain was so intense that his mind detached from his body, floating in a dimension where suffering transformed into a strange form of transcendence. When he awoke 3 days later, he was no longer the same boy, not physically nor spiritually. The following years unfolded in a peculiar and refined education. In the harem of Darius III, the last king of kings, Bagoas learned not only the arts of seduction and dance, but also the intricate political games that governed the empire. His androgynous beauty, delicate features that could belong to a young prince as much as a princess, combined with a sharp intelligence, quickly distinguished him among the other eunuchs. He mastered 6 languages, could recite Persian epics from memory, played the flute with a melancholy that moved even the most hardened generals, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read intentions behind unspoken words. The first encounter between Bagoas and Alexander wasn't fated, but orchestrated by political shrewdness. It was the winter of 331 BC, a few months after the Battle of Gaugamela, where the Macedonian army had delivered the final blow to the Persian Empire. Alexander, then 25, had established his temporary court in Ecbatana, the ancient summer capital of the Persian kings. The young conqueror, whose golden hair and almost transparent blue eyes contrasted dramatically with his sun-bronzed skin from the battlefields, received delegations of Persian nobles who came to surrender and offer their riches in exchange for clemency. It was Nabarzanes, one of the last satraps loyal to Darius, who presented Bagoas. The eunuch, then 18, moved with a feline grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His bare feet barely touched the marble floor, and the translucent fabric of his Persian robe flowed around his body as if made of materialized mist. When he knelt before Alexander, his raven-black hair cascaded over his bare shoulders, and something in the air of the room imperceptibly shifted. Alexander, who had conquered entire cities with a glance, felt momentarily disoriented by this creature who seemed to escape the normal categories of gender and power. Bagoas looked up, his eyes enormous, dark, and fringed with thick lashes, and Alexander saw reflected in them a depth he couldn't decipher. It wasn't submission, although his posture was reverent. It wasn't defiance, although there was something untamable in that gaze. It was as if Bagoas carried the secrets of a millennia-old civilization and offered them silently to the young Macedonian who was only beginning to understand the magnitude of his own conquests. "Rise," Alexander said, his voice rougher than he intended. When Bagoas rose in a single fluid motion, the conqueror realized the young man was almost his height. But where Alexander radiated the brute strength of a warrior, Bagoas emanated an almost ethereal elegance. "What is your name?" "Bagoas, my lord," the eunuch replied in perfectly articulated Greek with only a slight Persian accent that lent an exotic musicality to the words. "Your Majesty's servant, should you desire it." Alexander studied the face before him as if it were a map of unknown territory. Bagoas's features were of almost inhuman beauty. His skin had the texture of polished ivory, his lips were naturally red, as if touched by carmine, and his facial bones possessed such perfect structure that they seemed sculpted by a divine artist. But it was his eyes that most disturbed Alexander. There was an ancestral sadness in them that strangely contrasted with the youth of his body. That first night, Bagoas was led to his assigned quarters in the palace. His belongings, few but of exquisite quality, were placed in a small but elegant room overlooking the hanging gardens that Darius had built in imitation of those in Babylon. Alone for the first time in months, Bagoas allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He sat on the edge of the bed, a low structure covered in silks imported from China, and contemplated his own hands. They were delicate hands, with long fingers and carefully trimmed nails, but they bore the invisible marks of all he had lost and all he still stood to lose. The first few months in Alexander's court were a subtle dance of approach and retreat. The Macedonian conqueror, accustomed to resolving conflicts through brute force or direct diplomacy, found himself disconcerted by Bagoas. The eunuch didn't overtly seek his attention. On the contrary, he seemed to almost avoid him, appearing only when summoned and disappearing silently once his duties were fulfilled. But there was something magnetic about his reserve, a quality that made Alexander seek him out in the corridors and gardens even when there was no apparent reason. Bagoas, in turn, observed Alexander with the keen attention of someone who had learned early on that survival depended on correctly interpreting the moods and desires of the powerful. He saw how the young king consumed himself in an insatiable thirst for conquest, how his eyes shone when he spoke of cities yet unsubdued and peoples yet unknown. But he also perceived the moments of melancholy that Alexander tried to hide, moments when the weight of commanding an empire became visible in his slightly stooped shoulders and his gaze lost on the horizon. Their first intimacy didn't occur in the royal chambers, but in the gardens, during a full moon night when Alexander couldn't sleep. Bagoas found him walking among the rose bushes, still wearing the linen tunic he had worn during the formal dinner. The conqueror seemed smaller there, away from the symbols of power that usually surrounded him, closer to the 25-year-old he truly was than to the demigod that Macedonian propaganda had created. "Can't sleep, my lord?" Bagoas asked, emerging from the shadows with the silence he had perfected during years of life in palaces. Alexander turned, startled for a moment, before recognizing the familiar figure. "Dreams trouble me," he admitted, in a rare display of vulnerability that surprised them both. "I dream of my father, of Bucephalus, of the faces of men I killed and whose names I never knew." Bagoas approached slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "I can offer something that might help," he said, and his voice had a hypnotic quality that seemed to soothe Alexander's frayed nerves. "In Persia, we learn that music can ward off the demons that visit our dreams." Without waiting for an answer, Bagoas took a small silver flute ornamented with ancient Persian inscriptions from the folds of his tunic. When he began to play, the melody that emerged was of such pure and melancholic beauty that Alexander felt something shift in his chest. The music flowed like water over stones, carrying with it echoes of ancestral laments and lost hopes. It was the sound of Persia's very soul, distilled into notes that seemed to communicate directly with something deep within the human essence. Alexander closed his eyes and, for the first time in months, felt the muscles in his shoulders relax. When the last note dissipated into the night air, a profound silence settled between them. Not the awkward silence of uncertainty, but the intimate silence of mutual understanding. When Alexander opened his eyes, he found Bagoas watching him with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Alexander asked, his voice almost a whisper. "From my mother," Bagoas replied, and for the first time since arriving at court, his mask of serenity seemed to tremble slightly. Before everything changed. Something in Bagoas's momentary vulnerability touched Alexander in a way that no military conquest had ever managed. Here was someone who, like him, had lost his childhood prematurely, someone who carried invisible scars and interrupted dreams. Without consciously thinking about what he was doing, Alexander reached out and lightly touched Bagoas's face. The skin was even softer than he had imagined, and he felt the eunuch tremble slightly under his touch. "You are beautiful," Alexander said, and the words escaped his lips before he could censor them. "Beauty was my curse," Bagoas replied, but didn't move away from Alexander's touch. "And perhaps it will also be my salvation." That night, for the first time since becoming a man, Alexander discovered a form of intimacy that transcended mere physical conquest. With Bagoas, he didn't need to be the great strategist, the divine king, the insatiable conqueror. He could simply be Alexander, a young Macedonian far from home, carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders and a profound loneliness in his heart. Bagoas, in turn, discovered that his own castration, which had been intended as a form of control and diminishment, could also be a source of power of a different kind. In intimacy with Alexander, he wasn't the incomplete man that society considered him, but something unique, a bridge between worlds, capable of offering a form of love that transcended the conventional categories of domination and submission. The months that followed were the closest to happiness either of them had ever experienced. Alexander began to consult Bagoas not only on matters related to the administration of the Persian territories, but on strategy, diplomacy, and even philosophy. The eunuch's refined education, combined with his unique perspective on power and vulnerability, offered insights that the Macedonian generals, trapped in their own conceptions of masculinity and strength, couldn't provide. Bagoas, meanwhile, flourished under Alexander's genuine attention and respect. His influence at court grew subtly but steadily. Other eunuchs, Persian nobles, and even some Macedonians began to seek him out for access to the king. He navigated these political waters with the skill of someone who had learned from childhood that survival depended on being simultaneously indispensable and invisible. But empires, like all human constructions, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Alexander and Bagoas's happiness was built on shaky foundations: the constant need for territorial expansion, the growing tension between Macedonian and Persian values, and the insatiable nature of power that is never satisfied with what it possesses. The first signs of trouble appeared during the winter of 330 BC, when Alexander decided to officially adopt some Persian customs, including proskynesis, the ritual of prostration before the king that the Greeks considered appropriate only for gods. This move sparked furious resistance among the Macedonians, who saw it as a betrayal of Hellenic values and a capitulation to the barbarian customs of the conquered peoples. Clytus, one of Alexander's oldest companions and brother of his wet nurse, was particularly vocal in his opposition. During a banquet in Samarkand, fueled by wine and indignation, he publicly confronted Alexander, accusing him of becoming an Eastern despot who had forgotten his Macedonian roots. Clytus's words were like poisoned daggers, striking precisely at Alexander's deepest insecurities about his own identity. "You bow before Persian eunuchs as if they were oracles?" Clytus shouted, pointing directly at Bagoas, who watched the scene with growing horror. "Have you forgotten that you are the son of Philip, not some castrated barbarian king?" The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to have physical substance. Alexander, whose face had paled and then flushed with a fury everyone recognized as dangerous, slowly rose from his divan. Bagoas, sensing the imminent danger, tried to discreetly intervene, but Alexander had already passed the point of no return. "Guards!" Alexander roared, his voice echoing through the marble walls of the hall. "Seize this traitor!" But Clitus, also too drunk to gauge the consequences of his words, continued, "Traitor, am I? How many times have I saved your life while you played king with your Persian catamites? How many of us died so you could satisfy your Eastern appetites?" It was then that something irrevocably snapped in Alexander's mind. With a movement too fast to be intercepted, he snatched a spear from a guard and hurled it at Clitus. The iron point pierced the Macedonian's chest with a terrible sound, half sigh, half rip, and Clitus fell heavily onto the mosaic floor, his blood spreading in obscene patterns amongst depictions of military victories. The horror of what he had done struck Alexander instantly. He knelt beside Clitus's body, futilely trying to staunch the blood gushing between his fingers. "What have I done?" he murmured repeatedly, his voice breaking into sobs. "What have I done?" Bagoas watched the scene paralyzed. There stood the man who had conquered the known world, reduced to a terrified child facing the consequences of his own fury. But even more disturbing was the realization that the scene represented something larger, the beginning of a deterioration that would consume all they had built together. In the days following Clitus' murder, Alexander fell into a deep melancholia that not even Bagoas's presence could fully alleviate. He refused to eat, spent hours staring at the bloodstains that the servants couldn't completely remove from the mosaics, and constantly spoke to ghosts only he could see. Bagoas tried to comfort him with music, with gentle words, with his silent presence, but he sensed that something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. The court, meanwhile, buzzed with whispers and speculation. Clitus' death had exposed deep fissures in the empire's unity, and many of the Macedonian companions began to question not only Alexander's sanity, but also the growing influence of the Persian advisors, especially Bagoas. The eunuch perceived the hostile glances, heard the conversations that abruptly ceased when he approached, felt the subtle shift in the palace atmosphere. It was during this period of instability that Hephaestion, Alexander's childhood companion who had been absent during a campaign in the Hindu Kush mountains, reappeared. Hephaestion was everything Bagoas was not, a traditional Macedonian warrior, his muscles honed by war and his scars telling tales of glorious battles. His beauty was masculine and sun-kissed, contrasting dramatically with Bagoas's androgynous elegance. When Hephaestion returned and was informed of recent events, his reaction was one of controlled fury. During a private audience with Alexander, his words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unequivocal. "My lord," he said, "while you allowed yourself to be influenced by advisors of questionable loyalties, the empire nearly shattered. It is time to retake control." Alexander, still weakened by guilt and uncertainty, found in Hephaestion's presence an anchor to his original Macedonian identity. Their friendship, forged in childhood and tempered in dozens of battles, offered a form of legitimacy that no Persian conquest could provide. Gradually, Alexander began to distance himself from Bagoas, not abruptly or cruelly, but with the growing distraction of someone whose attention had been captured by more pressing concerns. Bagoas perceived the change with the keen sensitivity of someone who had learned to survive by interpreting the moods of the powerful. He saw how Alexander now sought out Hephaestion first at banquets, how their conversations extended into the late hours of the night, how his own advice was met with a distant courtesy that hurt more than any outright rejection. The downward spiral of Alexander. Bagoas's waning influence coincided with a particularly brutal phase of Alexander's Asian campaigns. The conqueror, as if attempting to compensate for his emotional vulnerability with displays of raw power, launched a series of attacks against local tribes with a ferocity that shocked even his most hardened veterans. Entire cities were razed with minimal resistance, populations were mass enslaved, and Alexander began to exhibit a growing paranoia regarding potential betrayals and conspiracies. It was in this context that the so-called Page Conspiracy erupted, a real or imagined plot involving young Macedonian nobles serving as Alexander's personal squires. The discovery, or fabrication, of the conspiracy provided Alexander with an opportunity to eliminate potential opponents through methods his own generals considered excessively cruel. The executions were carried out through public stoning, a method the Macedonians considered barbaric and unsuitable for free men. Bagoas watched the executions from a palace window, observing as Alexander remained impassive while youths the same age he was when castrated were beaten to death by frenzied mobs. A chilling sensation settled in his chest, not just horror at the deaths, but the terrible realization that the man he had fallen in love with was transforming into something monstrous. Alexander's transformation was not only moral but also physical. The constant stress of the campaigns, combined with accumulated injuries and excessive wine consumption, began to take its toll. His golden hair lost its luster, his skin took on a sickly pallor, and his eyes, once bright with the excitement of conquest, assumed a glazed quality that Bagoas recognized as a decaying soul. Their nights of intimacy became increasingly rare, and when they did occur, were marked by a desperate urgency that had more of despair than passion. Alexander seemed to seek in Bagoas not the comfort and understanding that had characterized their early encounters, but a temporary escape from the inescapable reality of his growing isolation. Bagoas submitted to these sessions with deep sadness, realizing he was being used not as a lover, but a drug against the existential pain consuming Alexander. The final breaking point came during the campaign in India, when Alexander decided to cross the Hyphasis River in pursuit of King Porus. His soldiers, exhausted by years of continuous marching and terrified by accounts of war elephants and venomous snakes awaiting them on the other side of the river, refused to proceed. It was the first time in Alexander's career that his men had disobeyed a direct order, and the conqueror's reaction was a fury bordering on insanity. For 3 days, Alexander locked himself in his tent, refusing to eat or receive visitors, hoping his soldiers would change their minds. Bagoas was one of the few permitted to enter, and what he saw there terrified him. Alexander had destroyed furniture, torn up maps, and paced in circles muttering threats against his own man. His fingernails were bleeding from compulsively scratching his hands, and his face wore an expression of megalomania that left no room for reason.
"They don't understand," Alexander said repeatedly, his eyes fixed on an invisible point on the horizon. "The ocean. I need to reach the ocean, where the world ends, where the gods await me." "My lord," Bagoas attempted in his softest voice, "perhaps it is time to consider returning. Your men are weary, and the empire needs consolidation." Alexander's response was a look of such fury that Bagoas instinctively recoiled. "You too?" Alexander whispered, and there was something broken in his voice. "Do you too join the cowards and traitors?" At that moment, Bagoas understood that he had lost Alexander forever, not to another lover, not to politics, but to a form of madness that transformed every gesture of care into betrayal, every sensible advice into cowardice. The man he had loved was dying inside, consumed by an ambition that had grown beyond any human proportion. The return from India marked the beginning of the final stage of Alexander's deterioration. Although he yielded to the pressure of his soldiers and began the retreat, the humiliation of having to retreat further corroded his sanity. He compensated for the frustration with increasingly extreme displays of cruelty. Entire cities were burned just to satisfy his need for destruction. Prisoners were executed in elaborate rituals that grotesquely blended Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions. Bagoas watched all this with the growing horror of someone witnessing the transformation of a loved one into a terrifying stranger. He tried a few times to approach Alexander, to offer comfort or simply presence, but he was invariably rejected, with a coldness that hurt more than any open aggression. Alexander had built around himself a barrier of paranoia and grandiosity that allowed no entry, not even for those closest to him. The death of Hephaestion in 324 BC was the final blow to Alexander's already fragile sanity. The Macedonian general, who had become not only Alexander's primary lover, but also his last link to his humanity, succumbed to a fever during the festivals in Ecbatana. Alexander's reaction to the loss was of an intensity that shocked even those accustomed to his emotional excesses. He ordered Hephaestion's physician executed for negligence, decreed an official mourning period that lasted for weeks, and ordered the demolition of the walls of several cities as a funeral offering to the dead. Even more disturbingly, Alexander began to speak to Hephaestion as if he were still alive, holding one-sided conversations during meals and consulting the ghost on military decisions. Bagoas watched this final deterioration with a mixture of horror and compassion that consumed him. A part of him still loved the man Alexander had been, but he couldn't recognize anything of that person in the paranoid tyrant he had become. He attempted one last approach, on a night when Alexander seemed particularly lost, offering to play the flute that had once brought peace to the conqueror. "You're still here?" Alexander asked, looking at Bagoas as if seeing him for the first time in months. There was something vaguely surprised in his expression, as if he'd completely forgotten the eunuch's existence. "I have always been here, my lord," Bagoas replied, his voice carrying the accumulated sadness of the past years. Alexander studied him for a long moment, and for an instant Bagoas thought he saw a flicker of the man he had loved. But then the expression hardened again. "I don't need music anymore," Alexander said, turning his attention back to the maps spread across the table. "I need silence to plan the next campaign." It was their last substantial conversation. In the weeks that followed, Alexander plunged ever deeper into his grandiose plans for new conquests. Arabia, Italy, perhaps even the mysterious lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Bagoas became a ghostly presence in the palace, technically still a member of the court, but effectively invisible to the man who had determined the course of his adult life. Alexander's death in June 323 BC arrived almost anticlimactically, after years of gradual deterioration. Officially, he succumbed to a fever after a banquet, but Bagoas, who had observed the last months of his life closely, suspected the conqueror had simply lost the will to live. His body, ravaged by wounds, illness, and excess, had finally given way under the pressure of carrying an empire that had grown beyond any human capacity to govern. Bagoas was present at the moment of death, not at the bedside as a lover should have been, but among the lesser servants and courtiers who formed the periphery of the circle of power. He watched as Alexander, delirious with fever, mumbled the names of dead men: Hephaestion, Clytus, even his father Philip. His eyes, once so piercing that they seemed able to see through souls, had become clouded like frosted glass. When Alexander's last breath escaped his lips, Bagoas felt something die within him too. Not only the love he had nurtured for years, but also a fundamental part of his own identity. He had defined himself for so long in relation to Alexander, first as his lover, then as his victim, that the conqueror's death left him without a reference point for who he himself might be. The days following Alexander's death were utter chaos. His generals, who had been held together only by the magnetic force of his personality, immediately began to vie for the fragments of the empire. Bagoas, like all the other eastern members of the court, found himself suddenly vulnerable and unprotected. The Macedonians, freed from the civilizing influence,